In the dusty heart of Dovetail Ridge, a trembling healer with soot-smudged hands was about to be burned as a witch. What started as a simple trip to gather wild thyme at the riverbank took a shocking turn when she returned to find a mob outside. Her cottage, torches raised and judgment already passed. Isolde Merren wasn't your typical apothecary. For nearly 17 years, she had treated wounds, delivered babies, and whispered old remedies to those too proud to thank her aloud. Known best for her uncanny gift of calming the dying with a single touch. When she found a wounded raven circling above the gallows, then landing at her feet, she had no idea she was being watched. Isolde lifted the bird, whispered a prayer, and the outlaw, watching from the bell tower, saw something the rest of them didn't. That moment would become the crack in everything. What began as a public execution would become an act of rebellion. The crowd froze when Elias Vane, the blood-marked outlaw with a bounty the size of the town's debt, strode through. The square tossed his rifle aside and said, "She's mine." Dovetail Ridge would never be the same after that. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook's town square as Ilara Whitmore knelt beside young Timothy Crawford, her weathered hands gentle against the child's burning forehead. The boy's fever had raged for 3 days, and Dr. Harwick had already proclaimed him beyond earthly help, advising the family to prepare for God's will. But Ilara saw something different in Timothy's glazed eyes, a spark of life that refused to surrender. "Willow bark tea," she murmured to Timothy's mother, Sarah, as she reached into her leather satchel. "And feverfew to break the heat. Mix them with honey and give him small sips every hour." Her fingers worked with practiced precision, measuring dried herbs that carried the earthy scent of the forest where she'd gathered them at dawn. Sarah Crawford's hands trembled as she accepted the small cloth packets. "Are you certain, Ilara? Dr. Harwick said—" "Dr. Harwick treats symptoms, not causes," Ilara replied, her voice firm but kind. "This fever comes from bad humors in the blood. These herbs will help his body find its natural balance again." She placed a cool compress made from mint and chamomile across Timothy's brow, and the child's labored breathing seemed to ease almost immediately. Around them, a small crowd had gathered in the square. Word traveled quickly in Millbrook when someone defied the town physician's pronouncements, especially when that someone was an unmarried woman who lived alone at the edge of town. Ilara felt their eyes upon her, some hopeful, others suspicious, but she focused only on Timothy's needs. "Witchcraft," came a harsh whisper from behind her. Ilara's hands stilled for just a moment before continuing their work. She knew that voice, goodwife Agnes Putnam, whose own bitter herbs had failed to save her husband the winter before. The elderly woman had never forgiven Ilara for the lives she'd managed to preserve when her own skills had proven inadequate. "She meddles with God's design," Agnes continued, her voice growing louder, more confident as others began to nod. "No natural remedy works so quickly. See how the child's color returns. That's Satan's power at work, stealing souls from the Lord's. Righteous judgment. That's enough, Agnes." Martha Henley pushed through the crowd, her tavern keeper's authority evident in her firm tone. "Ilara's herbs have saved more lives in this town than Dr. Harwick's bloodletting ever has. Young Timothy here would be dead without her intervention." But Agnes had found her audience now, and Millbrook's recent troubles with Indian raids and failed crops had left the townspeople hungry for someone to blame. "Look at her." Agnes pointed a gnarled finger at Ilara. "Unmarried at 25. Living alone, communing with plants and roots in the dark forest. She speaks to spirits in the woods. I've seen the strange lights from her cottage at midnight." Ilara finally looked up from Timothy, whose fever was indeed breaking faster than should have been naturally possible. Her grandmother's teachings ran deeper than mere herb lore, but she'd never used anything that could harm another soul. "I study healing by candlelight," she said calmly, "the same way any scholar might study scripture or law. There's nothing sinister in learning. Scripture tells us, 'Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live,'" Agnes declared, her voice carrying across the square. "This woman traffics with demons to work her unnatural cures. She's cursed this town with her presence." The crowd's murmur grew uglier, and Ilara noticed several people she'd helped over the years stepping back, their faces closed with fear. Mrs. Hartwell, whose broken arm she'd set when Dr. Harwick was drunk. Samuel Brooks, whose infected wound she'd cleansed with honey and herbs. Even Pastor Williams's wife, whose difficult childbirth she'd eased with raspberry leaf tea. All of them now looked at her as if she were something dangerous and foreign. "This is madness," Martha protested, stepping closer to Ilara. "You all know Ilara Whitmore. She's Thomas Whitmore's daughter, for heaven's sake. Her father was the finest blacksmith this town ever had, and she learned her healing from her grandmother, who served this community for 40 years before her." But Agnes had momentum now, and the crowd's fear was transforming into something hungrier. "The sins of the fathers," she intoned. "Who knows what dark bargains Thomas Whitmore made in his forge? Strange that he died so young, leaving behind a daughter with such unnatural talents." Ilara felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. Her father had indeed died younger than he should have, taken by a fever. Not. 3 years passed, a fever she'd been unable to break despite all her knowledge. The guilt of that failure still haunted her nights, and now Agnes was twisting even her greatest sorrow into evidence of evil. "My father was a good man," Ilara said, rising to face the crowd. "And if helping the sick is evil, then I gladly stand. Accused, I've never asked for payment beyond what people could spare. I've never turned away anyone in need, regardless of their station or their treatment of me. If that makes me a witch in your eyes, then perhaps your definition of evil needs examination." The words had barely left her lips when she heard the heavy footsteps approaching from behind. The crowd parted like water before the black-clad figure of Reverend Cornelius Blackwood, his pale eyes scanning the scene with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. "What disturbance troubles our peaceful morning?" Blackwood asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. He'd arrived too quickly, too conveniently, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. Agnes immediately launched into her accusations, embellishing them with each retelling. The crowd's fear was palpable now, feeding on itself and growing stronger. Blackwood listened with the patient attention of a judge, occasionally nodding or asking pointed questions that only served to make Ilara's situation worse. "And you admit to practicing these arts?" Blackwood asked Ilara directly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "I admit to studying the healing properties of plants, just as any physician might," Ilara replied. "I admit to helping those in need when I had the knowledge to do so. If God gave me this understanding, should I not use it for good?" "God's understanding comes through his ordained representatives," Blackwood said smoothly. "Individual interpretation of divine will has led many souls astray. Tell me, child, do you pray before gathering your herbs? Do you ask God's blessing on your remedies?" The question was a trap, and Ilara recognized it too late. If she said yes, she was claiming direct communication with God outside the church's authority. If she said no, she was admitting to practicing healing without divine sanction. "I pray as my grandmother taught me," she said carefully. "I give thanks for the bounty of creation and ask for wisdom to use it well." "Whose wisdom?" Blackwood pressed. "From what source comes this knowledge of yours?" Before Ilara could answer, young Deputy James Crawford pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with exertion and concern. "What's all this commotion about?" he asked, then stopped short, when he saw his sister Timothy sitting up for the first time in days, colour returning to his small face. "Your sister lives because of Miss Whitmore's intervention," Martha said quickly. "She broke the fever that Dr. Harwick said would surely kill him." Crawford's eyes moved between his recovering sister and Ilara, conflict written plainly across his young face. He was barely 22, newly appointed to his position, and clearly overwhelmed by the situation unfolding before him. "Deputy Crawford," Blackwood said, his voice carrying implicit command, "we have a situation here that requires your immediate attention. This woman stands accused of practicing witchcraft upon your sister. The evidence is clear, an impossible recovery achieved through unnatural means." "But my sister is alive," Crawford protested weakly. "Surely that's what matters." "What matters," Blackwood replied, "is the means by which this recovery was achieved. The devil can heal the body while damning the soul. Would you have your sister's temporary earthly wellness purchased at the cost of her eternal salvation?" Crawford's face went pale as the implications sank in. Around the square, the crowd was growing larger as more townspeople arrived to witness the spectacle. Ilara could see the moment when the deputy's duty overcame his gratitude, his hand moving reluctantly to the iron shackles at his belt. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry, but I have to. You'll need to come with me for questioning." "This is barbaric." Martha stepped forward, placing herself between Ilara and the deputy. "You're arresting a woman for saving a child's life. Have we lost all sense and reason?" "Stand aside, Martha Henley," Blackwood commanded. "Unless you wish to face similar accusations. It's well known that you've harbored this woman, provided her with shelter and supplies. Perhaps your association runs deeper than simple friendship." Martha's face flushed with anger, but Ilara caught her arm before she could respond. "Don't," Ilara whispered. "Don't give them another target. Your children need you." The words hit home, and Martha stepped back reluctantly, tears of frustration streaming down her face. "This isn't over," she said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "There are people in this town who remember what justice looks like." But even as Martha spoke, Ilara could see how few faces in the crowd showed support. Fear was a powerful poison, and it had already begun its work. People she'd known, her entire life, now looked at her with suspicion and dread, as if her very presence might contaminate them. Deputy Crawford approached with obvious reluctance, the shackles heavy in his hands. "Miss Whitmore, I need you to come with me. You'll be held until proper trial can be arranged." Ilara looked one last time at young Timothy, who was sitting up now and asking for water, the first words he'd spoken in days. His recovery would be used as evidence against her, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. She'd sworn an oath to her grandmother's memory to use her knowledge for healing, regardless of the cost to herself. "I understand, Deputy," she said, extending her hands for the shackles. The cold iron bit into her wrists, heavy with symbolic weight. As Crawford led her away from the square, she could hear Agnes Putnam's voice rising above the crowd, cataloguing every supposed sin and strange occurrence that could be laid at Ilara's feet. The makeshift jail was little more than a converted storage room behind the blacksmith's shop, her father's old shop, now run by a man who averted his eyes as she was led past his forge. The irony wasn't lost on her that she would spend her final nights as a free woman in the shadow of the place where her father had worked, where he'd taught her about strength and resilience and the importance of standing by one's principles. As the heavy door closed behind her and the key turned in the lock, Ilara sank onto the rough wooden bench that served as the cell's only furniture. Through the small barred window, she could see the town square where Timothy Crawford was now, standing on his own, his mother weeping with relief and gratitude that none would dare express openly. Her father's voice seemed to echo in the small space, reminding her of lessons learned at his forge. "Fire tests metal, daughter," he'd often said. "It either makes it stronger or reveals the flaws that were always there. A person's true nature shows the same way under pressure." As darkness fell over Millbrook and the sounds of the town settled into evening quiet, Ilara wondered what the coming trial would reveal about her own nature, and whether her father's teachings would prove strong enough to carry her through the flames of accusation and fear that now surrounded her. The test was about to begin. The test came sooner than Ilara had expected. 3 days in the cramped cell had passed in a blur of sleepless nights and meager meals brought by a silent Deputy Crawford, who couldn't meet her eyes. Through her small window, she'd watched the town transform around the upcoming trial. Neighbors speaking in hushed clusters, children hurried past the jail with frightened glances, and a steady stream of visitors arriving at Reverend Blackwood's residence to offer testimony or seek guidance. On the morning of the 4th day, Crawford unlocked her cell with hands that trembled slightly. "It's time, Miss Whitmore. The trial begins at noon." The meeting house had been rearranged for the occasion, with Reverend Blackwood seated at a table that served as both pulpit and judge's bench. A large wooden cross dominated the wall behind him, casting its shadow over the proceedings like a sword of judgment. The townspeople packed the benches, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and something that looked disturbingly like entertainment. Ilara was led to a simple wooden chair facing Blackwood, her shackles removed but replaced by the weight of countless staring eyes. She straightened her shoulders, drawing on her father's lessons about facing adversity with dignity intact. "We gather today," Blackwood began, his voice carrying easily through the packed room, "to examine the accusations brought against Ilara Whitmore, daughter of the late Thomas Whitmore. She stands accused of practicing witchcraft, of trafficking with Satan, and of endangering the souls of this godly community through her unnatural arts." The formal words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of whispered prayer and nervous movement throughout the assembly. Ilara noticed Martha near the back, her face pale but determined, flanked by her 2 young children who looked confused by the solemn proceedings. "Let the first witness come forward," Blackwood commanded. Goodwife Agnes Putnam rose with the satisfied air of someone whose moment had finally arrived. She took her place beside Blackwood's table, one gnarled, hand resting on a worn Bible as she delivered her oath. Her testimony was a poisonous blend of half-truths and wild speculation, painting Ilara as a creature of darkness who spoke with forest spirits and brewed potions under the light of unholy fires. "I've seen her gathering plants at midnight," Agnes declared, her voice growing stronger with each accusation, talking to herself or to unseen entities as she worked. "No Christian woman conducts such business in darkness unless she serves the Prince of Darkness himself." "And what of her unnatural success in healing?" Blackwood prompted. "Can you speak to that?" "Indeed I can," Agnes replied with relish. "My own dear husband, God rest his soul, suffered from the same fever that took Dr. Harwick's other patients. I used every remedy known to Christian healing, prayer, bloodletting, purging as the good doctor prescribed. Yet my husband died while others lived under her ministrations. If that's not evidence of demonic intervention, what is?" Ilara bit back her response. Agnes's husband had died because the woman had insisted on following Harwick's brutal treatments. Even as they weakened him further, Ilara had offered to help, but Agnes had refused, calling her herbs devil's weeds. Now that same pride and ignorance was being weaponized against her. Other witnesses followed, neighbors who spoke of strange lights from Ilara's cottage, customers who claimed their ailments returned after her treatments, though they failed, to mention the months of health between, and even young Mary Osborne, who tearfully confessed that Ilara had once given her herbs to prevent conception, though she quickly added that she'd never used them. Each testimony built upon the last, creating a web of suspicion that grew darker with every word. But when Deputy Crawford was called forward, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Crawford took his oath with obvious reluctance, his young face drawn with sleepless worry. "Deputy Crawford," Blackwood began, "you were present when the accused practiced her arts upon your sister. Tell us what you witnessed." I saw Miss Whitmore treat my sister Timothy's fever," Crawford said carefully. "The child had been dying, and after Miss Whitmore's treatment, she recovered." "And how quickly did this recovery occur?" Crawford's hands fidgeted with his hat. "Very quickly, sir. Faster than seemed natural." "Indeed. And did the accused use any methods familiar to Christian healing? Did she pray over the child, call upon God's mercy?" She used herbs, sir, plants and such. I didn't hear her pray, but—" Crawford's voice trailed off as he caught sight of his sister in the crowd, now healthy and bright-eyed, watching the proceedings with confused innocence. "But what, Deputy?" "But my sister lives," Crawford said, his voice growing stronger. "Whatever Miss Whitmore did, my sister lives. Because of it, that has to count for something." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Blackwood's eyes flashed with annoyance. "What counts, Deputy, is the means by which this recovery was achieved. The devil can preserve life to serve his own purposes. Your sister may walk among us, but what of her immortal soul? What contamination might she carry from such unholy healing?" Crawford's face went ashen at the implication, and Ilara saw him glance again at Timothy, horror dawning in his expression. Blackwood had found his weakness and twisted it with masterful cruelty. I don't know, sir," Crawford whispered. When Martha was called to testify, she strode forward with the confidence of someone who decided that speaking truth was worth any consequence. "I've known Ilara Whitmore since she was a child," Martha declared, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "I've seen her tend the sick, comfort the dying, and ask nothing in return but what people could spare. If healing the afflicted makes one a witch, then we should examine what sort of faith condemns mercy itself." Blackwood's smile was thin and dangerous. "Martha Henley, are you defending the practice of witchcraft before this assembly?" "I'm defending a woman whose only crime was possessing knowledge that saved lives," Martha replied, without flinching. "My own youngest son would be dead without her intervention. If that makes me complicit in whatever you're calling witchcraft, then so be it." The gasps from the crowd were audible, and Ilara saw several people move away from Martha's family, as if association itself might prove contagious. But Martha stood firm, her loyalty undaunted by the threat of sharing Ilara's fate. Finally, Blackwood turned to Ilara herself. "The accused will now speak in her own defense. Ilara Whitmore, how do you answer these charges?" Ilara rose slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, carrying the strength her father had taught her to find in truth. "I am guilty of studying the healing properties of plants," she began. "I am guilty of using that knowledge to ease suffering wherever I found it. I am guilty of believing that the same God who created these healing herbs intended them to be used for good. If these are crimes in your understanding of faith, then I stand condemned by my own conscience as much as your judgment." She paused, looking directly at Blackwood. "But I reject the accusation that my healing comes from evil sources. Every remedy I've used was taught to me by my grandmother, who learned from her grandmother before her, in an unbroken line of women who served this community with love and dedication. If there is evil in this room today, it lies not in the desire to heal, but in the willingness to call mercy a sin and compassion a crime." The silence that followed was complete, broken only by the sound of someone weeping quietly in the back of the room. For a moment, Ilara thought she might have reached them, might have broken through the fear that had consumed the town's reason. Then Blackwood spoke. and his words fell like a judge's gavel. The evidence is clear and overwhelming. Ilara Whitmore stands convicted of practicing witchcraft, of trafficking with demons, and of endangering the souls of this community through her unholy arts. The penalty prescribed by both divine and temporal law is death by fire, to be carried out immediately so that her evil influence may be purged from our midst. The crowd erupted in a mixture of cheers and gasps, though Ilara noticed that many faces showed more horror than satisfaction. But the decision had been made, and within the hour she found herself being led to the town square where a stake had already been prepared, as if the verdict had never been in doubt. The rough wood felt solid against her back as they bound. Her arms and legs, the rope tight enough to bite into her skin. Around the base of the stake, they piled kindling and larger pieces of wood, creating a pyre that would burn hot and fast. Blackwood stood before the gathered crowd, delivering a sermon about the necessity of purging evil, but his words seemed to fade into background noise as Ilara focused on the faces before her. There was Crawford, looking sick with guilt and confusion. Martha, tears streaming down her face as she held her children close. Timothy Crawford, too young to understand why the woman who'd saved her life was about to die for the act. And scattered throughout the crowd, others she'd helped over the years, some looking away in shame, others watching with the fascination of those witnessing something terrible but compelling. As Blackwood concluded his sermon and reached for the torch that would light her pyre, Ilara closed her eyes and thought of her father's words about fire-testing metal. Whatever flaws or strengths lay within her were about to be revealed in the most final way possible. The torch touched the kindling, and small flames began to lick upward, growing stronger with each passing second. The heat reached her feet first, and she braced herself for what was to come. Then, through the crackle of burning wood and the murmur of the crowd, came the sound that would change everything, the thunder of approaching horses, growing louder with each heartbeat, promising either salvation or a different kind of damnation entirely. The thunder of hoofbeats grew louder, drowning out even the crackling flames that licked hungrily at the base of Ilara's pyre. The crowd in the town square turned as one, their faces shifting from bloodthirsty anticipation to confusion and then to outright terror as 6 riders burst into view around the corner of Henley's Tavern. They rode like demons themselves, black horses foam-flecked from hard travel, their riders cloaked in dark leather and bristling with weapons. But it was the man leading them who commanded every eye, who seemed to draw the very air from the square with his presence. Tall and broad-shouldered, he sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to violence, his black hair flowing beneath a wide-brimmed hat adorned with a raven's feather. Twin pistols rode at his hips, and a cavalry sabre hung at his left side, all worn with the casual familiarity of tools well used. Silas "Blackjack" Morgan had arrived in Millbrook. The riders drew their mounts to a dramatic halt mere yards from the pyre, close enough that Ilara could feel the heat from their horses mixing with the flames at her feet. The crowd scattered like startled birds, pressing back against the buildings that lined the square, but none dared flee entirely. This was spectacle beyond their wildest imaginings. "Well, well," Silas said, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent square. His accent held traces of education beneath its frontier roughness, marking him as a man who'd fallen far from respectable origins. "What have we here? A barbecue in broad daylight. How uncivilized." Reverend Blackwood stepped forward, torch still in hand, his pale face flushed with indignation. "You have no business here, Outlaw. This is a lawful execution, carried out under proper authority. Take your men and be gone before you join her fate." Silas laughed, a sound like winter wind through dead trees. "Lawful execution." He swung down from his horse with fluid grace, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the packed earth. Of what crime exactly? Healing the sick? Saving children from fever? My, how the definition of lawful has changed since last I visited civilization. Witchcraft, Blackwood spat. This woman traffics with demons, practices unholy arts, corrupts the souls of the faithful. She has been tried and convicted according to God's law. God's law. Silas approached the Reverend with the predatory stride of a man accustomed to intimidating his enemies. Or your interpretation of it? I've noticed that men like you often mistake their own prejudices for divine. Will, he gestured casually toward his men, who remained mounted but had positioned themselves strategically around the square, hands resting on their weapons. But I'm not here to debate theology with a man who burns women for the crime of compassion. The flames were climbing higher now, and Elara could feel the heat beginning to sear her legs through her heavy skirts. Whatever this outlaw's purpose, if he didn't act soon, she would be beyond any earthly rescue. She tested her bonds, but the ropes were well secured, designed to hold even as the victim struggled against the approaching fire. I'm here, Silas continued, reaching into his coat with deliberate slowness, to collect what's rightfully mine. This woman's father owed me a considerable debt, and I've come to claim it. He produced a folded document from his inner pocket, its parchment yellowed with age, and bearing what appeared to be official seals. Thomas Whitmore's mark, witnessed and sealed. In the event of his death, his debts passed to his heir. That would be the young lady you're currently attempting to roast. Blackwood snatched the document, his eyes scanning its contents with growing fury. This is impossible. Thomas Whitmore was a respected member of this community, a godly man who served as a soldier before he became your saintly blacksmith, Silas interrupted. We rode together in the King Philip's War, fought side by side against the Wampanoag, saved each other's lives more than once, though I doubt he shared those particular stories with your congregation. His dark eyes found Elara's across the flames, and she saw something there that wasn't entirely mercenary, a flicker of genuine recognition, perhaps even sympathy. A gambling debt incurred during a particularly unfortunate evening in Providence. £50 sterling plus interest, quite a sum for a blacksmith to repay. Even if this document were genuine, Blackwood snarled, it gives you no authority to interfere with lawful justice. This woman stands convicted of witchcraft. Her earthly debts are meaningless now. Ah, but that's where you're wrong, Reverend. Silas's smile was sharp as a blade. Colonial law is quite clear on the matter of debt inheritance. The convicted party must settle all obligations before sentence can be carried out. It's an old tradition, dating back to English common law. Something about not cheating creditors through the convenience of execution. The lie was smoothly told, delivered with such authority that even Elara almost believed it. Several members of the crowd nodded uncertainly, their knowledge of legal matters insufficient to challenge the outlaw's claims. Deputy Crawford shifted nervously, clearly out of his depth in matters of law that extended beyond simple crime and punishment. This is preposterous, Blackwood began, but Silas cut him off with a gesture that somehow managed to be both casual and threatening. The law is the law, Reverend, unless, of course, Millbrook has decided to abandon all pretense of civilization and embrace simple mob rule. I'm sure the colonial authorities would be fascinated to learn that their appointed representatives are ignoring established legal precedent. He paused, letting the implications sink in. Of course, if the debt cannot be satisfied, I'll have no choice but to report this irregularity to the proper authorities in Boston, along with certain other observations about this community's adherence to lawful procedure. The threat was clear, and Blackwood's face went even paler. A visit from colonial investigators would mean scrutiny of his methods, questions about his authority, possible exposure of practices that wouldn't stand up to outside examination. For a man whose power depended on isolation and fear, such attention would be catastrophic. "What do you propose?" Blackwood asked through gritted teeth. "Simple. I take the debtor into custody, as is my legal right. She works off her father's obligation through service to my organization. Much more efficient than execution, and it satisfies both justice and practical necessity." The flames were licking at Ilara's ankles now, and she could feel the heat beginning to blister her skin. The pain was excruciating, but she forced herself to remain still, to show no weakness before these men who treated her fate like a business transaction. "Service?" Blackwood's voice dripped with suspicion. "What manner of service?" "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "The same skills that made her valuable to your community," Silas replied. "Healing, tending the wounded, providing medical knowledge where it's needed. My men live dangerous lives, Reverend. A skilled healer is worth considerably more than £50 to an organization like mine." It was a fiction, of course, but a plausible one. Outlaws did indeed suffer frequent injuries, and medical care was scarce on the frontier. The arrangement would appear legitimate to anyone not looking too closely at the details. "And if I refuse?" Blackwood asked. Silas's hand moved to rest, casually on the butt of his pistol. Around the square, his men shifted in their saddles, metal clicking against leather as weapons were subtly readied. "Then I'm afraid I'll have to insist on my legal rights through less civilized means. My associates and I have traveled a considerable distance to resolve this matter. We're not inclined to accept disappointment gracefully." The standoff stretched for long seconds, broken only by the crackling of flames and Ilara's labored breathing, as she fought against the heat that was beginning to consume her lower legs. She could see the calculation in Blackwood's eyes, weighing his pride against the very real threat posed by 6 armed outlaws who clearly had nothing to lose. Finally, Deputy Crawford stepped forward. "Reverend, perhaps we should consider—" "Silence!" Blackwood snapped, but his authority was cracking under pressure. He looked again at the document in his hands, then at the faces of his congregation, many of whom seemed more fascinated than supportive of his position. The spell of fear he'd woven was unraveling in the face of this unexpected challenge to his absolute power. "Very well," he said at last, the words seeming to tear from his throat. "Take her. But know this, outlaw, you carry a witch from this place. Her evil will corrupt your men, bring disaster upon your enterprise. Don't come crying to God for mercy when Satan's bargain comes due." Silas's grin was all teeth and dark promise. "I'll be sure to keep that in mind, Reverend. Jonas, if you would." A grizzled man with flame-red hair dismounted and strode toward, the pyre producing a wicked-looking knife from his belt. Without ceremony, he began sawing through the ropes that bound Ilara to the stake, working quickly but carefully to avoid the flames that had begun to char the wood around her feet. "Easy, lass," he murmured as he worked. "We'll have you free in a moment." The ropes parted, and strong hands pulled Ilara away from the fire, just as her skirts began to smolder. She stumbled, her legs weak from fear and pain, but Jonas caught her arm and steadied her with surprising gentleness. "Can you ride?" Silas asked, his voice businesslike now that the negotiation was complete. Ilara nodded, though she wasn't entirely certain it was true. The burns on her legs were painful, but not severe, and adrenaline was beginning to override the worst of her discomfort. "I can manage." "Good. We'll want to be well clear of your charming community before anyone decides to question the finer points of colonial law." He gestured toward a riderless horse, a bay mare with intelligent eyes and sturdy conformation. "She's gentle enough, but she'll keep pace when we need speed." As Ilara was helped into the saddle, she caught sight of Martha in the crowd, her friend's face a mask of relief and worry in equal measure. Their eyes met for just a moment, and Martha nodded slightly, a farewell that carried years of friendship and understanding. "This isn't over," Blackwood called as the outlaws prepared to leave. "I'll see you both hang for this mockery of justice." "You're welcome to try," Silas replied, swinging back into his saddle with practiced ease. "But I'd suggest you focus on explaining to your congregation how easily your authority crumbles when challenged by a handful of godless outlaws. Might raise some uncomfortable questions about the strength of your divine mandate." With that parting shot, he spurred his horse toward the edge of town, his men falling into formation around him with military precision. Ilara found herself in the center of the group, protected but also clearly captive, as they thundered out of Millbrook's town square and into the wilderness beyond. Behind them, smoke still rose from the abandoned pyre, a bitter reminder of how close she had come to death. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and a debt she neither understood nor had agreed to inherit. But as the wind whipped through her hair and the town's accusing faces faded into the distance, Ilara felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the intoxicating possibility of freedom, however complicated its price might prove to be. The horses maintained their punishing pace for what felt like hours, following game trails and forgotten paths that wound deeper into the Massachusetts wilderness. Ilara clung to her mare's mane, her burned legs throbbing with each stride, but she didn't dare ask them to slow. Behind them, somewhere in the growing distance, lay Millbrook and everything she'd ever known. Ahead stretched an unknown future, in the company of men whose reputation for violence preceded them like thunder before a storm. When they finally stopped beside a small creek, hidden deep in a grove of ancient oaks, the sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Ilara slid from her saddle with relief, her legs nearly buckling as they took her weight. The burns weren't severe, but they stung fiercely, and she could feel her stockings adhering to the damaged skin. "Easy there, lass," Jonas said, appearing at her elbow with surprising gentleness. "Take a moment to find your balance." Around them, the other outlaws were efficiently making camp, hobbling horses, gathering firewood, setting up a perimeter. Watch with the practiced ease of men accustomed to living rough. They worked mostly in silence, communicating through glances and gestures that spoke of long association and shared danger. Ilara watched them with growing curiosity. These weren't the savage desperados she'd expected. Their movements were disciplined, almost military in their precision. Their weapons were well maintained, their gear organized and functional. Whatever else they might be, they were professionals. "Billy, see to the horses," Silas commanded as he approached. "Marcus, take first watch. Thomas, get a fire going, but keep it small and smokeless." He turned to Ilara, his dark eyes assessing. "You're hurt." It wasn't a question. "The burns aren't severe," she replied, lifting her chin with what dignity she could muster. "I'll survive. I'm sure you will, but surviving and healing properly are different things." He gestured toward a fallen log near where the others were building their fire. "Sit, let me see the damage." "I can tend to my own injuries, thank you." Silas raised an eyebrow. "With what supplies?" "Your herb bag was left behind with everything else when we pulled you from that pyre. Unless you plan to chew bark and leaves like a deer, you'll need to accept some assistance." The truth of his words stung almost as much as her burns. In her rush to treat Timothy Crawford, she'd left her satchel at the Crawfords' home. Everything she'd inherited from her grandmother, her dried herbs, her carefully prepared tinctures, her collection of healing stones, was now beyond her reach. Reluctantly, she settled onto the log and watched as Silas knelt beside the creek, soaking a clean cloth in the cold water. His movements were gentle as he cleaned the worst of the ash and debris from her burns, more gentle than she'd expected from a man with his fearsome reputation. "You know something of healing yourself," she observed. "You pick up certain skills in my line of work," he replied without looking up. "Men get hurt, and physicians aren't exactly thick on the ground where we operate." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a small pottery jar. "Honey and comfrey, your grandmother's recipe, actually." Ilara's breath caught. "How could you possibly know?" "Because she taught it to your father, and he taught it to me." Silas's voice was quiet, almost reverent. "Thomas Whitmore saved my life more than once, Miss Whitmore. The least I could do was pay attention when he shared his knowledge." The gentle application of the salve felt blessedly cool against her burned skin, but Ilara's mind was reeling. "You knew my father, truly?" "I did." Silas finished bandaging her legs with strips of clean linen, his touch remaining professional despite the intimacy of the task. "We served together for 3 years during King Philip's War. He was the finest man I ever knew, and quite possibly the bravest." Around the small fire, the other outlaws had settled into evening routines, cleaning weapons, mending gear, sharing a simple meal of dried meat and hardtack. But Ilara noticed that Jonas kept glancing in their direction, his weathered face creased with what looked like concern. "The debt you mentioned," she said carefully, "was it real?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flickering flames. "The document was real enough. Your father did owe me money, not from gambling but from a business arrangement that went badly. But the debt—" He shook his head. "Thomas paid that back in blood years ago. What I owed him could never be repaid in coin." "Then why?" "Because I made him a promise." Silas looked up at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there during his confrontation with Blackwood. Vulnerability, perhaps. Even pain. The night before the battle at Turner's Falls, when we both thought we might not see another dawn, he made me swear something. If anything happened to him, if he didn't make it home to his family, I was to watch over you. Protect. You make sure you had the chance to live free. The words hit Ilara like a physical blow. Her father had never spoken of his military service, had deflected her questions about the years before her birth with gentle but firm dismissals. To learn now that he'd fought in one of the bloodiest conflicts in colonial history, that he'd formed bonds deep enough to inspire such loyalty, was like discovering she'd never truly known him at all. "He never told me," she whispered. "Thomas was a private man. He preferred to leave the war buried in the past where it belonged." Silas stood, brushing dirt from his knees. "But he also knew that his friendship with men like me might someday and put you in danger. That knowledge alone could be enough to damn you in the eyes of people like your Reverend Blackwood. So you fabricated a debt to give yourself legal justification for the rescue. Legal justification that no one in Millbrook had the knowledge or authority to challenge. Yes." His smile was grim. "Though I suspect our good Reverend won't let the matter rest there. Men like Blackwood don't take public humiliation well." As if summoned by his words, Jonas approached the fire, his expression troubled. "Silas, we need to talk. Privately." The two men moved away from the fire, their voices low but intense. Ilara couldn't make out their words, but their body language spoke of disagreement, possibly even argument. The other outlaws pretended not to notice, but she caught several worried glances exchanged around the flames. When they returned, Jonas's face was set in hard lines. "Boys," he announced to the group, "we've got some decisions to make. Word will be out by now about what happened in Millbrook. Every lawman between here and the Connecticut River will be looking for us, and they won't be particular about taking us alive." "Nothing we haven't faced before," said Billy, the youngest, of the group, barely out of his teens. "Maybe not," Jonas replied, "but we've never carried this kind of baggage before." His eyes flicked toward Ilara, not unkindly, but with obvious concern. A woman accused of witchcraft, rescued from execution by known outlaws. That's the kind of story that gets people's blood up. They'll hunt us with everything they've got. "What are you suggesting?" Silas asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "I'm suggesting we consider our options. Maybe it's time to split up, lay low for a while, and maybe—" Jonas paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe the lass would be safer somewhere else, somewhere far from us and the trouble that follows us." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken tensions. Ilara could see the logic in Jonas's words, could understand the burden her presence placed on these men who had risked everything to save her. But she could also see something else in Silas's face, a struggle between practical necessity and personal honor that was tearing him apart. "No," Silas said finally. "I made a promise to Thomas Whitmore, and I don't break my promises. She stays with us until we can find her a safe place to start over, somewhere she won't be hunted for crimes that exist only in the minds of fanatics. And if that gets us all killed," Jonas pressed, "then we die knowing we did right by a good man's daughter." Silas's voice carried absolute finality. "Anyone who can't live with that choice is free to leave. I won't hold it against you." One by one, the other outlaws nodded their acceptance, though some looked less certain than others. Billy actually grinned, apparently energized by the prospect of increased danger, but Jonas just shook his head, his weathered face creased with worry. "You're letting sentiment cloud your judgment, Silas. That's a luxury we can't afford in our line of work." "Maybe," Silas acknowledged, "but it's also what separates us from the animals we hunt. Without honor, without loyalty to something beyond ourselves, we're nothing but common thieves and killers." As the argument wound down and the men settled into their blankets for the night, Ilara found herself staring into the dying embers of their fire. She thought of her father, of the secrets he'd carried, of the bonds forged in battle that had somehow reached across the years to save her life. She thought of Martha, probably facing questioning about her part in harboring a witch. She thought of Timothy Crawford, alive and healthy because of knowledge that had nearly cost Ilara everything. Most of all, she thought about the choice that lay before her. She could accept Jonas's logic, ask them to take her somewhere safe and civilized, where she could disappear into anonymity, or she could stay with these dangerous men who had risked everything for a dead friend's promise, adding her own skills to their survival and perhaps finding in their rough company something she'd never known in Millbrook's oppressive atmosphere. A sleep finally began to claim her, wrapped in a borrowed blanket beside a fire tended by outlaws. Ilara realized that for the first time in her life, the choice was entirely her own to make. The freedom was both terrifying and exhilarating. Dawn broke grey and cold over the Massachusetts wilderness, bringing with it the sound Ilara had been dreading, the distant baying of hounds carried on the morning wind. She jerked awake from uneasy dreams to find the outlaw camp already stirring with urgent purpose, men rolling blankets and checking weapons with the efficient haste of those accustomed to sudden flight. "How far?" Silas asked Jonas, who stood at the edge of their small clearing with his ear cocked toward the sound. "Hard to say with the wind shifting," Jonas replied, his grizzled face grim, "but close enough that we need to move, now." As they broke camp, Ilara caught fragments of tense conversation between the outlaws. The pursuit had begun before dawn. Not just Deputy Crawford's reluctant posse, but something larger and more organized. Word had indeed spread beyond Millbrook, and the colonial authorities were taking the matter seriously. "Two groups at least," reported Marcus, who had returned from a scouting run with his horse lathered in sweat. "Crawford's leading one, looks like he's got maybe 6 men moving slow and careful-like. But there's another bunch coming hard from the east. Bigger group, and they're not showing the same restraint." Silas cursed under his breath. "Blackwood? Has to be. And they're pushing their horses harder than they should, which means they're not planning on a long chase. They want this finished quick." Within minutes, they were mounted and moving deeper into the forest, following game trails that wound between ancient trees whose canopy filtered the morning light into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. Ilara's mare seemed to sense the urgency, stepping carefully but quickly over roots and stones that could cripple horse and rider alike. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew steadily closer. After an hour of hard riding, they paused at a stream crossing where Jonas dismounted to study the soft earth. His expression when he straightened was troubled. "They're gaining," he announced. "And there's something else. Tracks heading south that don't belong to either group we've seen. Could be more bounty hunters, could be worse." "Worse how?" Billy asked, his youthful face pale beneath its coating of trail dust. "Word gets around. In our profession," Jonas replied grimly. "Story like rescuing a witch from burning is the kind of tale that travels fast. Could be men looking to collect on our heads. Could be folk who think killing a witch would earn them favor with God. Either way, they won't be inclined toward mercy." Silas was quiet for a long moment, studying the terrain ahead where the forest began to thin toward open meadowland. "How many men can we count on if it comes to a fight?" "6 of us, 7 counting the lass if she can handle a weapon," Jonas said. "But we're outnumbered at least 3-1, possibly more if these other groups converge on us." "I can shoot," Ilara said quietly, earning surprised looks from several of the outlaws. "My father taught me to hunt. I'm no marksman, but I can hit what I aim at." Thomas, the quietest member of their group, actually smiled at that. "Thomas Whitmore's daughter, right enough. Your father could put a ball through a playing card at 50 paces. The mention of her father brought a familiar pang of loss mixed with newfound curiosity. How many other skills had he possessed that she'd never known about? How many other secrets had died with him? "Still leaves us badly outnumbered," Jonas pointed out, "and that's assuming we can find good ground to make a stand. This open country ahead won't give us much advantage." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of hounds grew noticeably louder, accompanied now by the distant shouts of men driving their pursuit hard. They were running out of time and options. "There," Silas pointed toward a ridgeline visible through the trees ahead. "That outcropping near the top. It'll give us sightlines and put our backs to stone. If we're going to make a stand, that's our best choice." But even as they spurred their horses toward the ridge, Ilara could see the futility of it. They might hold such a position for hours, possibly even repel the first assault, but eventually weight of numbers would tell, and every moment they spent fighting was another moment that word of their location spread to draw more hunters. "Wait," she said suddenly, an idea forming in her mind. "What if we don't all go to the ridge?" The outlaws looked at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to alarm. "Hear me out," she continued quickly. "They're not just hunting you, they're hunting me. I'm the prize they really want. What if I gave myself up, created a distraction that would give you time to escape?" "Absolutely not," Silas said with flat finality. "I didn't risk my men's lives rescuing you just to hand you back to those fanatics. But if I surrender willingly, they might not pursue you as hard. They'd have what they came for." Jonas was shaking his head before she finished speaking. "You don't understand men like Blackwood, lass. Taking you alive would just be the beginning. He'd make an example of you that would echo across every settlement from here to Providence. And then he'd come after us anyway, to tie up loose ends and prove his authority. Besides," Billy added with surprising vehemence, "it wouldn't be right. You saved that little girl's life, and they tried to burn you for it. That's not justice, that's madness dressed up in religious clothes." The young outlaw's passionate defense brought a flush of warmth to Ilara's chest, but it didn't solve their immediate problem. The pursuit was closing in, and their options were dwindling with each passing minute. That's when Marcus, who had been scanning the forest behind them with a spyglass, uttered a curse that would have made a sailor blush. "What is it?" Silas demanded. "The two groups, they're converging. Crawford's bunch is coming from the west, Blackwood's from the east, and they're meeting up right about where we'd have to cross to reach that ridge." Marcus lowered his spyglass with grim resignation. "Looks like they planned this. We're being herded." The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Two groups of pursuers, coordinating their movements to drive the outlaws toward predetermined terrain where superior numbers could be brought to bear. It spoke of careful planning and intimate knowledge of the local geography, knowledge that suggested Blackwood had help from someone familiar with outlaw tactics. "Could be coincidence," Thomas suggested without much conviction. "Could be," Jonas agreed. "But I'm not betting my life on it, Silas. We need to make a choice now. Fight here in bad terrain, or try to break through one of those groups before they complete their pincer." Silas studied the landscape ahead, his face set in hard lines as he weighed impossible options. Break through to the east and face Blackwood's zealots, whose religious fervor made them dangerous beyond their numbers. Break through to the west and confront Crawford's official posse, which carried the authority of colonial law but might be more amenable to reason. "Crawford," he decided. "The deputy's a decent man caught in a bad situation. Maybe we can convince him to see reason." "And if we can't," Jonas asked, "then we fight our way through and keep running, but at least we'll be fighting men instead of rabid dogs." They turned their horses toward the western approach, pushing hard through increasingly open terrain that offered little concealment. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder and more coordinated. Ahead, glimpses of movement through the trees revealed the position of Crawford's posse, spread in a rough line that blocked their path to freedom. As they crested a low hill that brought both groups into clear view, Ilara felt her heart sink. Crawford's men had taken position behind fallen logs and boulders, their weapons trained on the approaching outlaws. Beyond them, barely visible through the forest, she could see the dark shapes of Blackwood's more numerous force moving to complete the encirclement. The trap was closing, and there seemed no way to avoid it. But then Silas did something that surprised everyone, including his own men. Instead of charging or seeking what cover the open ground offered, he raised his hand in a gesture of parley and rode directly toward Crawford's position, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Deputy Crawford," he called when he was within easy voice range. "I'd like a word, if you please, man to man, no weapons drawn." Crawford rose slowly from behind his makeshift barricade, his young face creased with uncertainty. "You're surrounded, Morgan. Surrender now, and I'll guarantee you fair treatment under the law." "Whose law?" Silas asked reasonably. "Colonial. Law, which requires due process and proper evidence, or Blackwood's interpretation, which burns women for the crime of healing the sick?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond the immediate standoff. In the distance, Ilara could hear Blackwood's men drawing closer, their shouts growing more distinct as they tightened the noose. Time was running out, and with it, any hope of avoiding the violent confrontation that would likely leave most of them dead in this lonely stretch of wilderness. Deputy Crawford's response was lost in the sudden crack of musket fire from the eastern woods. Blackwood's zealots had grown impatient with negotiations, and their shots sent Crawford's men diving for better cover, while the outlaws' horses reared and plunged in alarm. "So much for parley," Silas muttered, drawing his pistol as he fought. "To control his mount. Crawford, you'd better decide whose side you're on, because those madmen aren't distinguishing between us." Another volley erupted from Blackwood's position, and this time one of Crawford's men cried out as a musket ball found its mark. The deputy's face went white with rage as he realized Blackwood's forces were firing indiscriminately into the area, caring nothing for colonial authority or the lives of lawful representatives. "Cease fire!" Crawford shouted toward the eastern woods. "We have the situation under control." His answer came in the form of Reverend Blackwood himself, striding into the clearing with a smoking pistol in his hand and fury blazing in his pale eyes. Behind him came a dozen men armed with an assortment of weapons, their faces bearing the fanatic gleam of those convinced of their own righteousness. "Stand aside, deputy," Blackwood commanded. "This is God's work, and I'll brook no interference from temporal authority." "You fired on my men," Crawford replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "That's an act of violence against lawful officers of the Crown." "I fired upon those who would harbor witches and outlaws," Blackwood corrected. "If your men were struck, perhaps they should examine their own souls for corruption." The confrontation between the two groups might have continued, but Jonas chose that moment to grab Silas's arm and point toward the north. "River," he said urgently. "We can reach it if we move now, while they're arguing amongst themselves." Ilara followed his gaze and saw it, a line of trees that marked the course of a substantial waterway, perhaps half a mile distant across increasingly rough terrain. It would mean abandoning any hope of negotiation, committing fully to flight. But it also offered the possibility of escape if they could reach it before their pursuers reorganized. "The spring floods," Silas said, understanding immediately. "Water's running high and fast this time of year. If we can cross—" "Big if," Jonas replied grimly. "That current will be strong enough to pull down horse and rider both." Behind them, Blackwood's argument with Crawford was escalating, but Ilara could see some of the Reverend's men beginning to circle around the flanks of the dispute. In minutes, the temporary confusion would end, and they'd face the full weight of both groups' attention. "We go," Silas decided, "now, before they sort themselves out." They wheeled their horses toward the river, abandoning stealth for speed as they raced across the broken ground. Behind them, shouts erupted as their movement was spotted, followed by the crack of hasty shots that whistled overhead without finding targets. The terrain grew rougher as they approached the river, forcing them to dismount and lead their horses down a steep embankment carved by countless spring floods. Through the trees ahead, Ilara could hear the rush of fast water over stones, a sound both promising and ominous. When they reached the riverbank, her heart sank. The water was indeed running high, swollen with snowmelt from the distant mountains, and it moved with the inexorable power of nature unleashed. Foam-capped waves surged around boulders the size of houses, and debris swept past with alarming speed. Whole trees, parts of buildings, the occasional bloated carcass of some unfortunate animal caught in the flood. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," Thomas breathed. "That's more river than I've ever seen in one place." "Can we cross it?" Billy asked, his youthful bravado somewhat dampened by the sight of the raging torrent. Jonas was already studying the water, his experienced sailor's eye assessing currents. "And obstacles, maybe," he said finally. "There's a ford about 200 yards upstream. I can see the stone markers. Water's running over it, but the bottom should still be solid." "Should be?" Marcus asked. "Best we're going to get," Silas replied, as the sounds of pursuit grew louder behind them. "Everyone check your gear, make sure everything's secured. If you go in the water, you don't want to be weighed down by loose equipment." They mounted again and rode upstream along the muddy bank, their horses stepping carefully on ground softened by flood overflow. Behind them, their pursuers had reached the embankment and were beginning their own descent. Crawford's men moving with military precision, while Blackwood's zealots came down in a rushing mob that spoke more of enthusiasm than skill. The ford, when they reached it, was marked by 2 stone pillars that normally stood well above the water level. Now they were nearly submerged, with only their tops visible as landmarks in the rushing current. Between them, the water ran perhaps 4 feet deep, but it moved with enough force to stagger even the largest horse. "Rope!" Jonas commanded, producing a coil of sturdy hemp from his saddle. "We link up, cross together. If one goes down, the others can pull him out." They worked quickly to secure the rope around their waists, creating a human chain with Jonas at the front, his sailing experience making him the most comfortable in dangerous water. and Silas bringing up the rear. Ilara found herself positioned between Billy and Thomas, close enough to the middle that she'd have help from both directions if trouble arose. "Remember," Jonas called over the water's roar, "keep your horse's head up and let him pick his own footing. Don't fight the current. Work with it, and whatever happens, don't let go of that rope." The first step into the flood was shocking. The water was ice-cold and stronger than Ilara had expected, immediately trying to push her mare sideways toward the deeper channel downstream. The horse snorted and fought to maintain her footing on the slippery stones, her eyes rolling white with fear. "Easy, girl," Ilara murmured, keeping her voice calm despite her own terror. "Just take it one step at a time." They moved slowly across the ford, each step a careful negotiation between horse and rider, all of them fighting the inexorable pull of the current. Halfway across, the water reached the horses' bellies, and Ilara could feel her mare beginning to lose contact with the bottom, forced to swim in short bursts between patches of solid footing. That's when Billy's horse, perhaps spooked by a piece of debris that swept close to its legs, suddenly reared and lost its balance. The young outlaw went sideways into the torrent with a cry of alarm, his horse thrashing beside him as they were both swept toward the deeper water downstream. The rope jerked tight, nearly pulling Thomas from his saddle as Billy's weight came onto the line. For a terrifying moment, it seemed the entire chain would collapse as horses fought to maintain their footing against the sudden additional strain. "Hold fast!" Jonas shouted, though his words were nearly lost in the water's roar. Ilara saw Billy's head disappear beneath the surface, then bob up again 20 feet downstream, his face white with cold and fear as he fought to stay afloat. His horse had managed to regain its footing, but the young man was being dragged along by the current with only the rope preventing him from being swept away entirely. Without thinking, Ilara kicked free of her stirrups and dove from her horse's back into the icy torrent. The cold hit her like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and immediately numbing her extremities. The current seized her with brutal strength, spinning her around and dragging her toward Billy's struggling form. But years of swimming in the mill pond behind her father's forge had given her skills that now served her well, and she managed to angle her approach to intercept the drowning young outlaw. Her hand closed around Billy's collar just as he went under again, and she used every ounce of strength to pull his head above water. Together they fought the current while the others worked frantically to haul them both back toward the ford, using the rope that still connected Billy to the group. "Breathe," she shouted in his ear as he gasped and choked on river water. "Don't fight it. Let them pull us." It seemed to take forever, but gradually they were drawn back against the current to where willing hands could grasp them and drag them toward the far shore. Ilara's legs scraped against stones as she was pulled through the shallows, but she barely noticed the pain through the overwhelming relief of reaching solid ground. They collapsed on the muddy bank, gasping and shivering, while the others finished crossing and secured the horses. Billy was pale, but breathing normally, coughing up river water, but otherwise unharmed by his ordeal. "That was the bravest damn fool thing I've ever seen," Jonas said, wrapping Ilara in a dry blanket from his saddlebags. "And probably the only thing that could have saved him." Behind them, across the raging water, their pursuers had reached the ford, but stopped at its edge. The crossing that had nearly killed them all was clearly beyond the capabilities of men. On foot, and even Crawford's mounted men seemed reluctant to attempt it after witnessing the near disaster that had befallen the outlaws. "They'll have to go upstream to find another crossing," Silas observed, water still streaming from his clothes. "That should buy us hours, maybe a full day if we're lucky." But as they mounted their exhausted horses and prepared to continue their flight, Ilara noticed that not all of Blackwood's men had remained on the far side. Several figures were already working their way upstream along the bank, clearly intent on finding another way across. The pursuit would continue, but for now, they had breathing room. And perhaps more importantly, Ilara had proven herself to these hardened men in a way that mere words never could have accomplished. She was no longer just Thomas Whitmore's daughter, no longer just a burden to be protected. She was one of them now, for better or worse. The abandoned trapper's cabin emerged from the forest like a gift from Providence, its weathered log walls and moss-covered roof blending so perfectly with the surrounding wilderness that they might have ridden past without noticing if not for the thin wisp of smoke rising from its stone chimney. "Someone's home," Marcus observed, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Or someone was recently," Jonas corrected, studying the smoke with an experienced eye. "That fire's dying down, probably banked for a quick departure." They had been riding hard for 3 hours since the river crossing, following game trails that wound deeper into the Massachusetts wilderness. Billy, still pale from his near drowning but stubbornly refusing to show weakness, had insisted he could keep pace, despite Ilara's medical opinion that he needed rest and warmth to fully recover from his ordeal. Now, as evening shadows began to lengthen through the forest canopy, the sight of potential shelter was too tempting to ignore, even if it carried risks of its own. "I'll scout it," Thomas volunteered, already dismounting from his weary horse. "We'll both go," Silas decided. "Everyone else stay mounted and ready to run if this goes badly." They approached the cabin with the careful patience of men accustomed to walking into traps, weapons drawn but held low, using the forest cover to mask their approach. Ilara watched from her position with the horses, noting how they moved with coordinated precision despite the lack of verbal communication, another sign of the military training that seemed to run through the group like an invisible thread. After what felt like an eternity, Silas emerged from the cabin's doorway and waved them forward. "It's clear," he called. "Looks like whoever was here cleared out in a hurry, but they left supplies behind." The cabin's interior was sparse but functional. A single room with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn furniture, and shelves lined with the necessities of frontier life. Dried meat hung from the rafters. Clay jugs lined one wall, some still containing what smelled like decent whiskey, and a collection of basic tools and weapons suggested the previous occupant had been well prepared for extended isolation. "Trapper named Morrison," Jonas said, examining a ledger book left on the rough wooden table. "Looks like he was trading with the Abenaki up north, but something spooked him. Last entry was 3 days ago, says he heard rumors about witch hunters and bounty men heading into his territory." "Smart man," Silas observed, "probably saved his own life by clearing out when he did." As the outlaws settled into the cabin for what might be their first safe night in days, Ilara found herself studying these men who had risked everything to honor a dead friend's promise. Away from the immediate pressures of pursuit and survival, she could see them more clearly as individuals rather than simply components of Silas's gang. Billy, the youngest, was barely 18, but already bore the hard edges of someone who'd seen too much violence too early. He cleaned his weapons with the obsessive care of someone who knew his life depended on their reliability, but she'd noticed him carefully avoiding any mention of family or home, suggesting a past he preferred to leave buried. Thomas was perhaps 40, weathered and quiet, with the steady hands of a craftsman and the patient eyes of someone who'd learned to think before acting. His speech, when he bothered to speak at all, carried traces of education that hinted at a more refined background than his current circumstances suggested. Marcus was the group's scout and tracker, a lean man with native features who moved through the forest like he'd been born to it. His weapons were a mixture of European firearms and traditional tomahawks, and he seemed equally comfortable with both. And then there was Jonas, clearly Silas's second-in-command and closest confidant, whose weathered face and sailor's vocabulary spoke of years spent on ships before joining this land-based brotherhood. He questioned Silas's decisions more freely than the others, but his loyalty was evident in the way he positioned himself between his leader and potential threats. "Miss Whitmore," Silas said, interrupting her observations, "your burns need fresh dressing. That river water won't have done them any good." She had almost forgotten about her injuries in the excitement of their escape, but now that he mentioned them, she could feel the stinging reminder of her near execution. The cold water had probably prevented infection, but the wounds needed proper attention if they were to heal cleanly. As Silas worked with gentle efficiency to clean and rebandage her legs, using supplies from Morrison's well-stocked medical kit, Ilara found herself studying his face in the firelight. There were scars there she hadn't noticed before. A thin line along his left temple, another that disappeared into his hairline, the kind of marks that spoke of violence survived rather than sought. "You said my father saved your life," she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that the others couldn't easily overhear. "How?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, his hands continuing their careful work. "Turner's Falls," he said finally. "September of 1676. We were part of a scouting party that walked into an ambush, 100 Nipmuc warriors hidden in the rocks above the river. Most of our men were cut down in the first volley, but your father and I managed to find cover behind a fallen tree." His voice took on the distant quality of someone reliving old nightmares. "I took an arrow through the shoulder, another through my thigh. Lost too much blood to move properly, and the warriors were closing in to finish what they'd started. Thomas could have escaped, should have escaped. The sensible thing would have been to leave me and save himself. But he didn't. No, he didn't. Instead, he picked me up, all 6 feet and 200 pounds of me, and carried me half a mile through enemy territory to where our reserve forces were positioned. Took 3 more arrows doing it, any one of which could have killed him." Silas finished bandaging her legs and sat back on his heels. "I asked him later why he'd risked his life for mine. Know what he said?" Ilara shook her head. "He said that's what good men do for each other. No grand philosophy, no lengthy explanation. Just a simple statement of principle that defined who he was." Silas's eyes met hers across the flickering firelight. "That's when I knew I'd follow Thomas Whitmore anywhere, do anything he asked of me. And when he made me promise to protect his family if anything happened to him, I gave my word, without hesitation." The story filled in another piece of the puzzle that was her father's hidden past, but it also raised new questions. If you were such close friends, why did he never mention you? Why did you never visit or write? Pain flickered across Silas's features. Because he was trying to build a new life, a clean life, away from the violence that had marked our military service. Men like me, we carry that violence with us wherever we go. Your father knew that having an outlaw friend would only bring danger to his family, so he made the sacrifice of cutting those ties to keep you safe. Yet here you are. "Here I am," he agreed, "because sometimes the past catches up with us whether we want it to or not. And because some promises are more important than personal comfort." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, a single rider moving carefully through the forest darkness. The outlaws were instantly alert, weapons drawn and positions taken with the fluid efficiency of constant practice. Ilara found herself pressed against the cabin's back wall, a loaded pistol thrust into her hands by Billy with whispered instructions about which end to point at threats. "One rider," Marcus reported from his position by the window, "moving slow like they're not sure of the way." "Could be a scout," Jonas suggested grimly. But when the rider finally emerged into the clearing visible through the cabin's windows, Ilara gasped in recognition. "Martha!" Her friend sat slumped in her saddle, her face drawn with exhaustion and her traveling clothes mud-stained from hard riding. She looked around the clearing uncertainly, clearly lost and possibly near collapse from whatever desperate journey had brought her to this remote place. Ilara was moving toward the door before anyone could stop her, ignoring Silas's sharp command to wait. She burst from the cabin and ran toward Martha, who nearly fell from her horse in relief at seeing a familiar face. "Ilara, thank God," Martha gasped, accepting her friend's steadying embrace. "I wasn't sure I'd find you. Wasn't sure you were still alive. What are you doing here? How did you find us?" "I followed the signs you left," Martha replied, allowing herself to be helped down from her exhausted mount. "Broken branches, disturbed, ground, the usual trail markers. Your father taught you well before he died. He taught me too, back when we were all younger and sometimes had to find each other in the woods." The revelation that her father had shared wilderness skills with Martha was another surprise, but Ilara filed it away for later consideration. More pressing was understanding why her friend had risked so much to follow them into the wilderness. "Martha, you shouldn't have come. It's not safe." "Nowhere's safe now," Martha interrupted, her voice carrying a bitterness that chilled Ilara's heart. "Not for anyone who ever showed you kindness or defended your actions. Blackwood's turned the whole town upside down, looking for conspirators and accomplices. Anyone who ever accepted your healing, anyone who spoke in your defense, anyone who showed the slightest reluctance to condemn you, we're all suspect now." As they helped Martha into the cabin, where Jonas immediately began preparing hot food and stronger drink, the full scope of the disaster began to emerge. In the 3 days since Ilara's rescue, Millbrook had transformed into something approaching a police state, with Blackwood using the crisis to consolidate his authority and eliminate anyone who might challenge his interpretation of divine will. "He accused me of witchcraft," Martha said, cradling a cup of Morrison's whiskey with shaking hands. "Said I'd been corrupted by long association with you, that my defense of your actions proved I was in league with Satan." When Deputy Crawford tried to object, Blackwood suggested he might be compromised as well. After all, his sister had been saved by your unnatural healing. "What happened to James?" Ilara asked, though she dreaded the answer. "He's alive but barely, stripped of his authority, confined to his home while they investigate his fitness for duty. They've brought in men from other towns to serve as temporary lawmen, men who don't know any of us, who see only what Blackwood tells them to see." The systematic destruction of anyone who'd shown Ilara sympathy was chilling in its efficiency. Blackwood wasn't just hunting witches. He was using the crisis to remake Millbrook according to his own vision, eliminating opposition and installing absolute theocratic control. "I had to leave," Martha continued. "My children. I sent them to my sister in Providence before Blackwood could move against them. Then I took what supplies I could carry and followed your trail, hoping to warn you that this is bigger than just a simple manhunt now." "How much bigger?" Silas asked, his voice carrying the authority of a military commander assessing a tactical situation. Martha's answer chilled them all. "He sent word to every settlement from here to Connecticut claiming you're in league with Satan, that you've corrupted a witch to serve your unholy purposes. There's a bounty on your heads now, 50 pounds for you, 30 for each of your men, and 100 pounds for Ilara, to be delivered alive for proper trial and execution." The sums were staggering, enough to tempt every bounty hunter, desperate man, and fortune seeker within 100 miles. More than that, the religious framing would appeal to zealots and fanatics who might pursue them for reasons that had nothing to do with money. "There's more," Martha said, reaching into her traveling pack. "I brought some things from your father's belongings. Items I thought you should have, items that might help you understand what you're facing." She produced a leather portfolio, its edges worn smooth by years of handling. Inside were papers, letters, and what appeared to be a journal bound in cracked leather that smelled of forge smoke and metal polish. "Your father's private papers," Martha explained. "He asked me to keep them safe after he died, said someday you might need to know the truth about his past. I think that day has come." As Ilara opened the journal, her hands trembling slightly, the first entry she saw was dated only 2 years before her father's death. The handwriting was unmistakably his, but the content was unlike anything she'd ever expected to read. "If anyone reads this, it means I'm dead, and the past has finally caught up with my family. Ilara, if you're reading this, know that everything I did was to protect you, to give you a chance at a normal life away from the violence that marked my younger years. But I always feared that someday my sins would find you, and I made certain preparations." The journal went on to detail not just her father's military service, but his continued involvement in activities that straddled the line between legitimate business and outright smuggling. More shocking still were references to a network of like-minded men, former soldiers, displaced persons, and others who existed on the margins of colonial society, who had maintained contact over the years despite their scattered circumstances. "He never stopped caring about the men he served with," Martha said softly, watching Ilara read, "and they never stopped caring about him. When word of your situation spread, it wasn't just Silas who wanted to help. There are others, Ilara. Men who remember Thomas Whitmore and honor the debts they owe him." The implications were staggering. What had begun as a single outlaw's promise to a dead friend was part of something larger, a brotherhood forged in war and maintained through the years by bonds stronger than law or convention. "How many others?" Silas asked, and Ilara could hear the hope beginning to creep into his voice. "I don't know exactly," Martha admitted, "but the journal mentions at least a dozen names, with details about how to contact them if the need ever arose. Your father was more connected than any of us realized, and apparently more prepared for trouble than even he let on." As the night deepened and the fire burned low in Morrison's fireplace, they pored over the journal together, uncovering a web of relationships and obligations that painted Thomas Whitmore in an entirely new light. He hadn't been just a simple blacksmith trying to leave his past behind. He'd been the quiet center of a network of men who'd found ways to survive and even prosper in the rough years following King Philip's War. More importantly, he'd left detailed instructions for how that network could be activated in case of emergency. Names, locations, codes, and procedures that could transform Ilara's situation from desperate flight to strategic retreat with allies and resources she'd never known existed. "There's a place," she said, finding a passage that made her heart race with possibility. "Fort Whitmore, not the ruins where we were trapped, but another place that shares the name. A trading post near the Connecticut border, run by a man named Samuel Morrison, probably related to the trapper who owned this cabin. Father says it's a safe haven for men like himself, men who exist between the legal and illegal worlds. The prospect of sanctuary, of allies, of a chance to turn the tables on their pursuers energized the group in ways that simple rest and supplies couldn't have managed. But even as hope began to replace despair, Ilara found herself grappling with the larger implications of what she'd learned. Her father hadn't been the simple, straightforward man she'd remembered. He'd been a leader, a strategist, someone who'd maintained dangerous connections while building a facade of respectable normalcy. The skills he'd taught her, healing, yes, but also tracking, wilderness survival, even basic weapons handling, hadn't been the innocent gifts of a loving parent. They'd been preparation for a life he'd hoped she'd never need to live, but had been determined to prepare her for nonetheless. As she looked around the cabin at these hard, dangerous men who'd risked everything to honor his memory, she began to understand that her choice wasn't really about whether to accept their protection or strike out on her own. It was about whether to embrace the legacy her father had left her, a legacy of loyalty, brotherhood, and the kind of honor that existed outside the boundaries of conventional law. The fire burned lower, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls as Ilara made her decision. Tomorrow, they would head for Fort Whitmore and the allies who waited there. Tonight, she would accept the truth about who she was and who she was meant to become. Thomas Whitmore's daughter was finally coming home. The dawn brought with it the sound Martha had warned them to fear. The baying of hounds carried on the morning wind, closer now than they had ever been. But this time, the sound came from two directions, confirming their worst suspicions about the coordination of their pursuers. "They found us," Marcus reported from his watch position, his weathered face grim as he studied the forest through Morrison's spyglass. "Two groups, maybe three, one coming from the south, that'll be Crawford's official posse, another from the east, moving faster and louder, has to be Blackwood zealots." "The third group?" Silas asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Harder to make out, but they're moving like professionals. Could be bounty hunters, could be military. Either way, they know what they're doing." The cabin that had seemed like salvation the night before now felt like a trap, its single room and limited exits offering no realistic chance of escape if they were surrounded. But as Ilara studied her father's journal by the early morning light, an idea began to form, one that was either brilliant or suicidal, with little room between the two possibilities. "Fort Whitmore," she said suddenly, causing every head in the room to turn toward her. "Not the trading post we were planning to reach, but the ruins where they tried to corner us before. My father's journal says it was more than just a military outpost. It was a symbol." She read aloud from the leather-bound pages. Fort Whitmore stood not just as a defensive position, but as a declaration that some things are worth dying for. The men who fought there understood that true honor sometimes requires standing against overwhelming odds, not for victory, but for principle. Jonas shook his head. "That's poetry, lass, not tactics. Those ruins won't give us any better position than we had before, and we'll be even more outnumbered now. But they will give us something else," Ilara continued, her voice growing stronger as the plan crystallized. "A place to make our stand that means something. My father and Silas fought there together, bled there together. If we're going to face our enemies, let it be on ground that represents what we're truly fighting for." Silas was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the growing daylight. "You're not talking about escape anymore, are you? You're talking about ending this, one way or another." "I'm talking about truth," she replied. "Blackwood's power comes from fear, from people's willingness to believe his version of divine will rather than trust their own judgment. But what if we forced him to face the truth about himself in front of witnesses? What if we made him choose between his fanaticism and his survival in a place where lies can't hide?" Martha, who had been listening with growing alarm, stepped forward. "Ilara, you're talking about putting yourself directly in that madman's hands. Even if your plan works, even if you expose his hypocrisy, he'll still try to kill you." "Perhaps," Ilara acknowledged, "but I'm tired of running from accusations I don't deserve, tired of watching good people suffer for showing me kindness. At Fort Whitmore, with witnesses present, we can force a reckoning that settles this matter once and for all." The plan that emerged over the next hour was audacious in its simplicity. They would ride to Fort Whitmore openly, making no attempt to hide their trail, ensuring that all three pursuing groups would converge on that symbolic ground. There, Ilara would use the evidence Martha had brought, her father's journal, testimonies about Blackwood's past abuses, proof of his manipulation of colonial law, to expose the Reverend's true nature before representatives of legitimate authority. "It's a gamble," Jonas admitted as they prepared to leave Morrison's cabin. "If Crawford's men side with Blackwood despite the evidence, we'll be facing execution by a mob, rather than any kind of legal process." Then we make sure they don't, Silas replied, checking his weapons with the careful attention of a man preparing for his last fight. We make sure the truth is so clear, so undeniable, that even Blackwood supporters have to acknowledge it. The ride to Fort Whitmore took 3 hours through increasingly familiar territory, following trails that Elara remembered from childhood explorations with her father. Now she understood why he had brought her to these places, why he had insisted. She learned every path and landmark. He had been preparing her for exactly this kind of situation, though she doubted even he could have foreseen the specific circumstances that had brought her here. The ruins of Fort Whitmore sat on a low hill overlooking a natural clearing, its broken stone walls and crumbling foundations still impressive despite years of neglect and weather. It had been built to control the river crossing below, positioned to command the surrounding terrain while offering multiple escape routes to defenders who knew the ground intimately. Good fields of fire, Thomas observed as they took positions among the ruins. We can see them coming from any direction, and these walls will stop musket balls. More importantly, Silas added, it's where your father and I learned what it meant to stand for something greater than ourselves. If we're going to make our final stand, I can't think of a more appropriate place. They didn't have long to wait. Within an hour, the first pursuers appeared at the edge of the clearing, Crawford's official posse, moving with military discipline but obvious reluctance. The young deputy looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept since the chase began, and several of his men kept glancing around nervously as if expecting an ambush. Blackwood's group arrived shortly after, their approach marked by shouts and the kind of aggressive posturing that suggested they were more interested in intimidation than tactics. The Reverend himself rode at their head, his black clothes and pale complexion making him look like death personified as he surveyed the ruins where his quarry had chosen to make their stand. The third group took longer to show themselves, but when they did, Elara felt her heart sink. These were professional soldiers, uniformed men who carried themselves with the confidence of those accustomed to overwhelming their enemies through superior training and equipment. At their head rode a captain whose insignia marked him as regular colonial militia, not local volunteers. "Captain Morrison!" Silas called out as the 3 groups arranged themselves around the ruins. "I take it you're related to the trapper whose cabin we borrowed." "My cousin," the officer replied, his voice carrying across the clearing with parade ground authority. "And you're the outlaws who've been terrorizing the countryside, corrupting witches and defying lawful authority." "That depends on your definition of lawful authority," Silas responded. "Deputy Crawford there represents legitimate colonial law. Reverend Blackwood represents religious fanaticism disguised as divine mandate. Which one are you here to support?" It was a clever question, one that forced the captain to choose sides publicly before the confrontation could escalate further. Crawford straightened in his saddle, perhaps realizing that this was his moment to reclaim the authority that Blackwood had systematically undermined. "Captain Morrison," Crawford called, "I am the lawfully appointed representative of colonial authority in this district. These men are wanted for questioning in connection with the rescue of a condemned prisoner, but they have not been proven guilty of any capital crime. I request your assistance in taking them into custody for proper legal proceedings." "Proper legal proceedings," Blackwood's voice cut across the clearing like a whip crack. "These men harbor a witch, Captain. They've allied themselves with Satan's servant and spread her corruption wherever they go. There can be no legal process. For such creatures, only purification by fire." "Reverend Blackwood," Elara called out, rising from her position behind the ruined wall, "I have something that might interest you. Evidence of your own past activities, your own relationship with the truth you claim to serve so faithfully." She held up her father's journal, its leather binding clearly visible to all three groups of armed men. "My father kept detailed records, Reverend. Records of your time in other parishes, your pattern of false accusations, your history of using witch trials to eliminate personal enemies and consolidate power." Blackwood's face went white, then flushed red with fury. "Lies!" he shouted. "Fabrications created by Satan to protect his servant." "Then you won't mind if I read some excerpts." "Aloud," Ilara continued, opening the journal to pages Martha had marked with strips of cloth. "Captain Morrison, Deputy Crawford, you might find this particularly illuminating." She began to read, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing as she detailed Blackwood's expulsion from his previous parish for falsely accusing 3 women of witchcraft, women who had opposed his attempts to seize control of church property. The accusations had been proven false when one of Blackwood's own supporters confessed to fabricating evidence, but by then 2 of the women were already dead. "More lies!" Blackwood screamed, but his voice carried less conviction now, and several of his own men were looking at him with growing uncertainty. Martha emerged from her position behind the ruins, carrying a leather satchel filled with documents. "I have testimonies, Captain," she called. "Sworn statements from members of Reverend Blackwood's former congregation, detailing his methods and motives. Men and women of good standing who were willing to put their accusations in writing." The captain was looking increasingly uncomfortable as the evidence mounted, clearly realizing that he had walked into a situation far more complex than a simple outlaw hunt. "Reverend Blackwood," he said carefully, "these are serious accusations. Perhaps we should—" "I'll hear no more of this," Blackwood snarled, drawing a pistol from beneath his black coat. "The witch corrupts even honest soldiers with her lies. She must die now, before her poison spreads further." The shot rang out across the clearing, but Blackwood's aim was spoiled by his fury. The ball struck stone near Ilara's head, sending fragments flying but leaving her unharmed. What followed was chaos, as 3 different groups of armed men tried to decide who were enemies and who were allies in a situation that had suddenly turned deadly. Silas's outlaws returned fire immediately, their weapons trained not on Crawford's men or the captain's soldiers, but on Blackwood's zealots who had drawn their own weapons in support of their leader's attack. Crawford shouted orders to his men to hold their fire, trying to maintain some semblance of legal authority in a situation spiraling rapidly out of control. Captain Morrison found himself caught between his duty to maintain order and his growing realization that the real threat to colonial stability wasn't the outlaws he'd been sent to capture, but the fanatic who was using religious authority to circumvent legal process entirely. The gunfight was brief but decisive. Blackwood's zealots, for all their religious fervor, were no match for seasoned fighters like Silas's outlaws or disciplined soldiers like Morrison's militia. Within minutes, half of them were down, and the others were throwing down their weapons. In surrender, Blackwood himself, wounded in the shoulder and seeing his support crumbling around him, made one final desperate attempt to complete his mission. Drawing a second pistol with his good arm, he aimed directly at Ilara's heart, his pale eyes blazing with the fanatic certainty of a man who believed his cause justified any action. The shot that killed him came from Deputy Crawford's rifle, the young lawman finally finding the courage to choose justice over intimidation. Blackwood crumpled to the ground, his black clothes blending with the shadow cast by Fort Whitmore's ancient walls, his crusade ending where so many others had found their rest. In the sudden silence that followed, Captain Morrison surveyed the scene with the weary expression of a professional soldier who had seen too much unnecessary death. "Deputy Crawford," he said finally, "it appears you have matters well in hand. Here, I'll be returning to report that the threat to colonial stability has been resolved." As the captain's men began their withdrawal, carrying their wounded and preparing to escort Blackwood's surviving followers back to face legal consequences for their actions. Ilara felt the weight of the past weeks finally beginning to lift from her shoulders. The truth had triumphed, but at a cost that would echo through her memory for years to come. The man who had tried to burn her for witchcraft was dead, but so was any hope of returning to the simple life she had once known. The silence that followed Blackwood's death stretched across the clearing like a held breath, broken only by the moans of wounded men and the nervous pawing of horses sensing the tension in the air. Ilara stood among the ruins of Fort Whitmore, her father's journal still clutched in her hands, staring down at the crumpled form of the man who had nearly destroyed everything she held dear. Deputy Crawford lowered his smoking rifle with hands that trembled slightly, his young face pale with the realization of what he had done. I had to, he said, though it wasn't clear if he was speaking to the assembled crowd or trying to convince himself he was going to murder her in cold blood. "You did the right thing, Deputy," Captain Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of long military experience. That man was operating outside any legitimate authority, using religious rhetoric to justify what amounted to vigilante justice. He surveyed the scene with professional efficiency, already mentally composing the report he would have to write. The colonial government takes a dim view of such disruptions to civil order. As Morrison's soldiers moved to secure the scene and tend to the wounded, Ilara found herself facing the representatives of legitimate authority for the first time since her rescue from the pyre. Crawford approached her with obvious uncertainty, his duty warring with the gratitude he felt for her saving his sister's life. "Miss Whitmore," he began formally, then stopped and shook his head. "Ilara, I owe you an apology. I should have stood up to Blackwood from the beginning, should have insisted on proper legal procedures instead of letting fear and intimidation guide my actions." "You were in an impossible situation, James," she replied, using his given name deliberately to underscore her forgiveness. Blackwood had consolidated power through fear, and challenging him directly would have put your own family at risk. I understand why you did what you felt you had to do. "But it wasn't right," Crawford insisted. "I took an oath to uphold justice, and I let a fanatic pervert that oath for his own purposes. People suffered because of my weakness, and you nearly died because I was too cowardly to do my duty." Captain Morrison, who had been listening to this exchange while his men worked, stepped forward with the measured pace of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. "Miss Whitmore, there are still legal questions to be resolved regarding your situation. The original charges of witchcraft were clearly fabricated, and Reverend Blackwood's death has removed the primary source of accusations against you. However, your association with known outlaws complicates matters considerably." The captain's gaze shifted to Silas and his men, who had maintained defensive positions among the ruins but made no threatening moves since the shooting stopped. "Silas Morgan, you and your men are wanted for numerous crimes throughout the colony. The rescue of Miss Whitmore, regardless of its noble motives, doesn't erase your past actions." "We understand that, Captain," Silas replied calmly. "But perhaps the circumstances warrant some consideration. We acted to prevent the murder of an innocent woman by a corrupt official who had perverted legal process for his own ends. If that makes us criminals in the eyes of the law, then perhaps the law needs examination." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the competing demands of legal duty and practical justice. Around them, the evidence of Blackwood's corruption was overwhelming. Martha's testimonies, the journal entries detailing past abuses, the sworn statements from his former congregation. To prosecute the men who had exposed this corruption would create more problems than it solved. "There is precedent," the captain said finally, for granting amnesty to individuals who aid in exposing serious crimes against colonial authority. Blackwood's systematic abuse of religious and legal power represents exactly the kind of threat to civil order that such provisions were designed to address. He paused, letting the implications sink in before continuing. However, such amnesty would require assurances that future conduct will remain within legal boundaries. The colony cannot be seen as rewarding lawlessness, even when that lawlessness serves the cause of justice. Jonas stepped forward, his grizzled face showing the first hope Ilara had seen there in days. "What kind of assurances, Captain?" "Disbanding of the Outlaw band, for starters. No more raids on colonial settlements or merchant caravans. Any man who wishes to take advantage of this amnesty must demonstrate his commitment to lawful conduct through legitimate employment and residence within established communities." The offer hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Freedom, but at the cost of the brotherhood that had sustained these men through years of danger and hardship. Ilara could see the pain in their faces as they contemplated the dissolution of bonds forged in shared risk and mutual loyalty. "And Miss Whitmore?" Martha asked, speaking for the first time since the shooting. "What of her situation?" Captain Morrison's expression softened slightly. The charges against Miss Whitmore were clearly unfounded, based on fabricated evidence and religious extremism rather than legitimate legal process. With Reverend Blackwood dead and his conspiracy exposed, there is no legal basis for continued prosecution. She is free to go where she chooses and live as she sees fit. The words should have brought relief, but Ilara found herself struggling with emotions far more complex than simple gratitude. Freedom meant choices, and choices meant uncertainty about a future she had never imagined having to plan. "There is one complication," Morrison continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. "The bounties placed on your heads by various communities still stand, regardless of official amnesty. Word of Blackwood's death and the exposure of his corruption will eventually reach those who posted rewards, but in the meantime, you remain at risk from bounty hunters and others who might not have received updated information." "How long before that situation resolves itself?" Silas asked. "Months, possibly longer. Communication between settlements is slow, and some bounty hunters might choose to ignore official statements if the rewards are high enough." Morrison's expression grew grave. "My advice would be to relocate far from the areas where you're known, perhaps even consider leaving the Massachusetts colony entirely until the situation stabilizes." As the immediate crisis began to wind down and practical considerations took precedence, Ilara found herself walking among the ruins of Fort Whitmore, tracing the broken stones with her fingers and thinking about the layers of history contained within these walls. Her father had fought here, had formed the friendships that had ultimately saved her life. Men had died here defending principles they believed worth any sacrifice. Now she stood here facing her own crossroads, her own choice between safety and something larger than personal comfort. Martha joined her among the ruins, her friend's familiar presence a comfort amid all the uncertainty. "It's over," Martha said simply. "You're free to go home, to rebuild your life in Millbrook if you choose." "Am I?" Ilara asked, not looking up from the weathered stone she was examining. "Blackwood is dead, but the fears he exploited are still there. The people who wanted me burned 3 days ago haven't suddenly become enlightened because their leader was exposed as a fraud. They'll still see me as different, dangerous, someone to be watched and suspected." "Then, don't go back to Millbrook," Martha suggested. "Come with me to Providence, where my sister lives. Start fresh somewhere new where nobody knows your history." It was a reasonable suggestion. the safe choice that would allow Ilara to disappear into anonymity and rebuild her life without the weight of recent events. But as she looked around at the men who had risked everything to honor her father's memory, she realized that safety had never been what she truly wanted. "I've learned something about myself these past days," she said, finally meeting Martha's eyes. "I'm not the person I thought I was. Not just Thomas Whitmore's daughter trying to live quietly and help her neighbors. I'm someone who can dive into a raging river to save a drowning man. Someone who can stand up to fanatics and demand justice. Someone who belongs with people who understand that some principles are worth fighting for." She gestured toward Silas and his men, who were engaged in quiet discussion about their own uncertain futures. "These men are losing the only family they've known because of their decision to save me. They're facing exile from the life they've built together, separation from the brotherhood that sustained them through years of hardship. I can't just walk away and pretend their sacrifice doesn't matter." "What are you saying, Ilara?" Before she could answer, Silas approached them, his expression thoughtful but resolved. "Miss Whitmore, I wanted to thank you for what you did here today. Using your father's journal to expose Blackwood's corruption was brilliant. It gave us the moral high ground we needed to survive this confrontation. It was the least I could do, considering what you've sacrificed for me. That's what I wanted to discuss with you." Silas glanced back at his men, then continued. "Captain Morrison's offer of amnesty is generous, but it comes with conditions that would scatter us to the winds. We've been together for 8 years, through dangers and hardships that created bonds stronger than blood. The thought of abandoning those bonds, even for legitimate freedom, is unbearable," Ilara finished for him. "Yes, but there might be another option, if you're willing to consider it." Silas's voice carried a note of hope that had been absent during their earlier conversations. "Your father's journal mentions other men, other communities of people who exist on the margins of colonial society. Traders, guides, frontier entrepreneurs who operate in the spaces between legitimate settlement and complete wilderness. They need skills like ours, and like yours." Ilara felt her heart begin to race as she understood what he was suggesting. "You're talking about starting over, but not alone, building something new that honors what you've built together while staying within the bounds of legal conduct." "I'm talking about Thomas Whitmore's dream," Silas replied. "He used to say that someday there would be communities where a person's worth was measured by their actions rather than their ancestry, where skills and character mattered more than social standing or religious orthodoxy. Places where someone like you could practice healing without fear of persecution, where men like us could find honest work that utilized our abilities without requiring us to abandon our principles." The vision he painted was compelling, a life that combined freedom with purpose, community with independence, safety with the kind of meaningful challenge that made existence worthwhile. But it would also mean leaving behind any hope of returning to the familiar world she had known, accepting permanent exile from conventional society in exchange for the chance to build something better. "The frontier settlements beyond the Connecticut River," Martha said thoughtfully. "There are trading posts there, communities that exist mainly to serve trappers and fur traders. They're too remote for much official oversight, but civilized enough to offer real opportunities for people with the right skills. And they desperately need medical knowledge," Silas added. "Frontier life is dangerous, and qualified healers are scarce. Someone with your abilities would be welcomed with open arms, no questions asked about your past." As the afternoon sun began to slant through the ruins of Fort Whitmore, casting long shadows across the stones where her father had once fought for his beliefs, Ilara made her decision. It wasn't the safe choice, wasn't the conventional path that most women of her background would have chosen, but it was the choice that honored both her father's legacy and her own hard-won understanding of who she truly was. "When do we leave?" she asked, and felt the last chains of her old life fall away like iron shackles finally broken. The price of freedom, she realized, wasn't just the courage to seize it. It was the wisdom to recognize it when it was offered, and the strength to build something worthy of the sacrifice required to obtain it. Behind them, Deputy Crawford was organizing the return journey to Millbrook, where he would have to explain Blackwood's death and restore legitimate legal order to a community traumatized by weeks of religious extremism. Captain Morrison was preparing his own reports, documenting the resolution of a crisis that could have destabilized colonial authority throughout the region. But ahead of them lay the vast American wilderness, full of dangers and opportunities. In equal measure, where outcasts and dreamers could forge new communities based on merit rather than tradition, where the courage to heal and the willingness to protect the innocent were virtues to be celebrated rather than feared. Thomas Whitmore's daughter was finally free to become whoever she chose to be. 3 months later, Haven's Rest, Connecticut Territory. The morning sun cast golden light across the bustling settlement of Haven's Rest, illuminating a community that existed in the liminal space between wilderness and civilization. Built around a natural harbor where the Pequot River curved through rolling hills, the town served as a vital trading hub for fur trappers, frontier merchants, and the growing number of settlers who sought opportunity beyond the rigid social structures of established colonial communities. Ilara stepped out of her clinic, a converted storehouse that sat on the main street between Henderson's trading post and the newly constructed church that served all denominations equally, a revolutionary concept that would have scandalized the religious authorities of Massachusetts. The morning air carried the scent of pine forests and wood smoke, mixed with the more prosaic odors of horses, leather, and the endless activity of a settlement that never quite slept. Her clinic had grown beyond her wildest expectations in the 3 months since their arrival. Word of her skills had spread quickly through the network of trappers, traders, and frontier families who comprised Haven's Rest's diverse population. Unlike Millbrook, where her healing abilities had been viewed with suspicion, here they were regarded as valuable commodities worthy of respect and generous compensation. The burns on her legs had healed completely, leaving only faint scars that served as reminders of how close she had come to a very different fate. But more than her physical wounds had healed in this place. The constant fear that had shadowed her final months in Millbrook had gradually faded, replaced by the confident knowledge that she belonged in this community of practical-minded individuals who judged people by their actions rather than their adherence to religious orthodoxy. "Morning, Miss Ilara," called Tom Henderson from his trading post doorway. The burly former fur trapper had become one of her staunchest supporters, spreading word of her abilities throughout the territory and ensuring she never lacked for patients who could pay for her services. "Got a new family coming in today on the Hartford Road. Word is they've got a child with the lung fever. Might need your attention." "I'll prepare some coltsfoot tea and pine needle tincture," she replied, already mentally reviewing the supplies in her well-stocked clinic. The luxury of having access to both traditional healing herbs and new remedies from other cultures, represented in Haven's Rest, had expanded her medical knowledge considerably. "Send them over whenever they arrive." As she prepared for the day's work, Ilara reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that terrifying morning when Goodwife Putnam's accusations had shattered her quiet existence. The woman who had once limited herself to treating familiar neighbors with familiar ailments had evolved into something approaching a frontier physician, dealing with everything from arrow wounds to complicated childbirths to diseases she had never encountered in the more settled regions of Massachusetts. The transformation hadn't been without its challenges. learning to navigate the complex social dynamics of a community where former outlaws worked alongside reformed criminals, religious refugees, and dispossessed Native Americans, had required skills her sheltered upbringing had never developed. But with those challenges had come freedoms she had never imagined possible. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the street, where a familiar figure was dismounting from a well-maintained bay gelding. Silas had ridden in from the construction site where he spent most of his days now, working alongside Jonas and the other former outlaws to build the settlement's new blacksmith forge and foundry. The transition from outlaw leader to legitimate businessman had not been easy for any of them, but Silas had embraced the challenge with characteristic determination. His military engineering background, combined with years of practical experience maintaining weapons and equipment under field conditions, had made him invaluable to a community that desperately needed skilled metalworkers. "Good morning," he said, approaching with the easy smile that had become more frequent as the months passed, and the constant tension of hunted men gradually faded. "I wanted to catch you before the day gets too busy. There's something I need to discuss with you." Ilara felt a flutter of concern. Over the past 3 months, their relationship had evolved from the complicated dynamics of protector and protected into something warmer and more equal, but they had both been careful not to push beyond the boundaries of friendship and professional respect. The last thing she wanted was to complicate the delicate balance they had achieved. "Of course. Would you like some coffee?" Martha brought fresh beans from her last trading run to Hartford. They settled on the bench outside her clinic, watching the morning bustle of Haven's Rest wake up around them. The settlement now boasted nearly 200 permanent residents, with more arriving weekly as word spread about the opportunities available in this haven for those who didn't fit comfortably into conventional colonial society. "I've been thinking about the future," Silas began, his tone more serious than their usual conversations. "Not just my own future, but the future of this place, this community we're all building together. It's remarkable what's been accomplished in such a short time," Ilara agreed. "When we first arrived, I wasn't sure a place like this could really work. Too many different people, with too many different backgrounds and motivations. But somehow it's functioning better than communities that have been established for decades." "That's because it's based on principles your father would have recognized," Silas replied. "Merit over birthright. Practical cooperation over theoretical ideals, judgment based on actions rather than assumptions. It's what he always said colonial society could become if people were willing to abandon their prejudices and work together." Bishitu. The mention of her father brought the familiar mix of loss and pride that had become more bearable over time, but never entirely disappeared. In Haven's Rest, Thomas Whitmore's memory was honored not through formal ceremonies, but through the daily application of the values he had embodied: loyalty, competence, and the willingness to risk everything for principles worth defending. "There's been a development," Silas continued, reaching into his coat to produce a folded letter sealed with official-looking wax. "This arrived yesterday with the mail packet from Hartford. It's from Deputy Crawford." Ilara's breath caught as she recognized the careful handwriting on the envelope's exterior. She hadn't heard from James Crawford since their parting at Fort Whitmore, though Martha's occasional letters had kept her informed about the situation in Millbrook and the surrounding area. The letter's contents proved to be both reassuring and melancholy. "Dear Miss Whitmore, I hope this letter finds you well and settled in your new circumstances. I felt compelled to write with news that I believe will be of interest to you. The situation in Millbrook has stabilized considerably since Reverend Blackwood's death. His remaining supporters have either left the community or accepted the authority of our new minister, Reverend Samuel Hartwell, who preaches a considerably more moderate interpretation of Scripture. There have been no further accusations of Witchcraft and the atmosphere of fear that dominated our town for so long has largely dissipated. More importantly for your situation, the colonial authorities in Boston have officially withdrawn all bounties and warrants related to your case. The investigation into Blackwood's activities revealed a pattern of corruption and abuse that extended far beyond Millbrook, and you are now officially recognized as a victim of religious persecution rather than a criminal fugitive. This means, should you ever wish to return to Massachusetts, you would be welcomed not only as... Perfect timing, Martha announced as she joined them on the bench. I have news that's going to change everything. She opened the portfolio to reveal a collection of documents, maps, and what appeared to be official correspondence bearing various colonial seals. I've been in communication with representatives from 3 different colonial governments, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Pennsylvania. They're all interested in supporting the expansion of communities like Haven's Rest. Supporting how? Silas asked, though his tone suggested he suspected the answer might be significant. Land grants, trade agreements, official recognition as legitimate settlements rather than temporary frontier camps, Martha explained, her enthusiasm growing as she spoke. The colonial authorities have finally realized that places like this serve as valuable buffers between established settlements and hostile territory, while also providing essential services to the fur trade and other frontier industries. She spread out a map that showed the Connecticut River Valley and surrounding territory, with several areas marked in red ink. They're offering us a choice of 3 different locations where we could establish a permanent chartered community, full legal recognition, local self-governance, guaranteed land rights, and official protection from outside interference. The implications were staggering. What had begun as a refuge for outcasts and misfits was being offered the opportunity to become a legitimate part of colonial society, with all the rights and protections such status implied. There would be conditions, of course, Martha continued. The community would need to meet certain population requirements, demonstrate economic viability, and agree to provide services like mail delivery and militia support when needed. But the basic principle would be self-governance according to our own values and priorities. Ilara studied the map, noting that all 3 proposed locations were even further from Massachusetts than their current settlement. Accepting such an offer would mean permanent commitment to frontier life, abandoning any possibility of returning to the world she had known before her persecution began. When do they need an answer? She asked. The formal proposal needs to be submitted within 6 months, but they want a preliminary response within 30 days to begin the surveying and legal processes. Martha's expression grew more serious. This is the opportunity Thomas always dreamed of, the chance to build a community based on merit and mutual respect rather than inherited privilege and religious orthodoxy. But it would require everyone to commit fully to the project, no reservations or backward glances. As if summoned by the mention of commitment, Jonas approached from the direction of the construction site, his work clothes dusty from a morning spent laying foundation stones for the new forge. Behind him came Billy, Thomas, and Marcus, the former outlaws, who had found new purpose in legitimate labor but still maintained the bonds forged during their years of shared danger. "Heard there was news," Jonas said, settling onto the steps of the clinic, with the easy familiarity of old friendship. "The way people have been talking sounds like it might be important." Martha quickly outlined the colonial proposal, while the gathered group listened with expressions ranging from excitement to careful consideration. When she finished, the silence stretched for several minutes as each person contemplated what such a commitment would mean for their individual futures. "It's everything we talked about during those long nights around campfires," Billy said finally, his youthful enthusiasm undimmed by months of hard physical labor. A place where a man's past doesn't define his future, where people are judged by what they do, rather than where they came from. Aye, Thomas agreed in his quiet way. And a place where skills are valued over social standing, where someone, like Miss Ilara, can practice her healing without fear of persecution or suspicion. But it would mean giving up any possibility of returning to our old lives, Marcus pointed out, ever the practical strategist. No going back to Massachusetts, no reconciliation with families or communities that might eventually forgive past mistakes. This would be a permanent choice.